everyone, and welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Just a kind reminder, please refrain from turning on your microphone during the duration of today's recording and presentation. Today, we are joined by Dr. A. Shultz, who will be presenting on Shinto in Japan. Dr. Shultz is an associate professor of Asian religion and philosophy at Kansai Gaidai University. His research interests are especially related to contemporary Japan and include religion and popular culture, mountain asceticism, and pilgrimage. Full details regarding his background are available on his personal website, www.japanjohn.com, and we will put that in the chat for you. Dr. Shultz, it's so wonderful to have you today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you take it from here.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be here. Welcome to all those folks in the audience. As Amani explained, I am not an expert on Shinto. I do most of my research in areas like Buddhism and pilgrimage and so forth. So nonetheless, I've had the pleasure of teaching a 15-week course on Shinto for international students for about 6 years now, and it's really popular. There's a lot of enthusiasm, and I myself have become really filled with enthusiasm for the topic. So I hope you can feel that enthusiasm. I hope you can kind of cultivate some interest yourself in what I believe is a rather fascinating subject. So if you don't mind, please let me try to shrink down a 15-week course on Shinto into 30 minutes for you, if I could, please. So I figured that the best way to approach our topic tonight is simply just to begin with the term Shinto, which you see behind me right here, Shinto. The Shin part is another pronunciation for kami. I think you've heard that name before, like in kamikaze. Those are the indigenous deities we're speaking about. And then to in Japanese is also pronounced michi. That's the way. So Shinto is the way of the kami to get things started. Perhaps you've had this experience where you're speaking with a friend and they might suggest something like, Shinto is not a religion, or say, for instance, Zen Buddhism is not a religion. Have you had such an experience before? On the one hand, perhaps it's a little preposterous because these institutions they're registered religious corporations with the Japanese government. They enjoy tax-free status and so forth. But on the other hand, when we're thinking about a worldview or a religious tradition more as something you do, like a path that you walk, we can kind of understand a bit of contrast in why people might say that Shinto is not a religion. That is to say, perhaps coming from a Judeo-Christian background, maybe a more European background, you tend to associate religion with a set of beliefs or a set of principles. Isn't it true? If you go to the Catholic Mass on Sunday, Catholics state their entire set of beliefs in the Nicene Creed. We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And they state all those principles, and adhering to those ideas, adhering to those doctrines makes you a Catholic. That's really not the case in a religious tradition where the focus is more on the way or more on the doing, if you will. This is why I tend to avoid the English term Shintoism, because you can already see it's not really a thought system per se. In fact, what's kind of remarkable about Shinto is really how non-doctrinal it is for a major religious tradition. Remarkably non-doctrinal. Indeed, Shinto is kind of willing to leave out major religious questions, like the existential questions that humans face inevitably, such as big questions like, what happens when I die? you'll see that contemporary Shinto doesn't have a lot of explanation for such things. Those kind of doctrinal points are not so critical. So I think considering Shinto as something we do a way rather than as a set of beliefs, we can start to understand how Shinto can and has coexisted with other religious traditions, particularly that of Buddhism. So maybe you've had this experience as well. You might be with your Japanese friends, and maybe the subject of a particular religious institution comes up, and maybe your Japanese friends get a little bit nervous. Uh, they'll think to themselves, is that a Shinto shrine? Is that a Buddhist temple? Or maybe you're talking about some type of deity, and they might get a little nervous. Is that a kami? Is that a Buddha? It might be a little bit mixed up in their head. And when your Japanese friend thinks that way, you might think, well, it's just ignorance. They don't know religion so well. But to tell you the truth, as I often say, I think that's really kind of the traditional Japanese worldview. In the traditional Japanese mind, the Buddhas and the kami are all mixed up together. And the fact of the matter is, for most of Japanese history, kami worship and the worship of Buddhas and other beings like bodhisattvas was completely mixed together. It was not until 1868 when the Japanese government, by law, mandated the separation of Buddhas and kami and Shinto buildings and Buddhist buildings. So some people have argued that Shinto, as an independent religious tradition, really only kind of comes into being, around 1868 when that separation takes place. So once again, because we're talking about a path that you walk, something you do, one very important and perhaps rather curious aspect of Shinto is faith is not really required for Shinto related behaviors. Does that make sense? That is to say, I think for most people coming from, say, a European tradition, or once again from a Judeo Christian tradition, you have to believe that the God is really real, true, existing, and then you pray to the deity. But in Japan, that's not the case at all. And in point of fact, actually, when it comes to Japanese kami, Japanese tend to pray for very practical things: uh, love, wealth, that their favorite football team wins upcoming soccer match, and so forth. So let's think about this as an example. This is the very stressful entrance exam season right now in Japan. So senior students in high school are preparing to take the entrance examinations over the next few weeks. And this will kind of determine their place in life for a lot of them. So let's think of an example. We have a student named Midori. Midori has set her sights very high. She would like to enter the College of Global Engagement at Kansai Gaidai University. Woohoo! But she knows it's very competitive. So Midori is going to study very diligently in preparation for the exam. But in addition, she's going to go with her family to Osaka Tenmangu Shrine, which is dedicated to Tenjin Sama. That is the kami of learning and scholarship. And you can find Tenjin shrines all over Japan, all towns, villages, and cities, big and small, because so many students have to pray in such a situation. So Midori goes to Osaka Tenmangu Shrine. She stands in front of the main hall. She prepares to pray to the Kami-sama. If we were to ask her, Midori, is Tenjin really real? Does he exist? She might we might expect her to kind of shrug her shoulders. I'm not sure. But that won't prevent her from praying to the kami. If Midori is talented and lucky and she passes the entrance exam, very likely she will return to the shrine and she will thank Tenjin Sama, the kami of learning. And then you see how this works? It's very empirical. Now she starts to believe, hey, it worked. Okay, here's proof. I passed the entrance exam. And so, although faith wasn't required in order to pray to the kami, it's often reinforced maybe by the outcome of the prayers, if you will. Good, good, good. Finally, when we're thinking on the way side of the equation here, another really particular, very curious point about Shinto is really how silent it is on many, many ethical issues, right? When you think about religion in general, you think about a very strong association with certain ethical issues, certain ethical principles, the Ten Commandments, the Golden Rule, and so forth. But Shinto is largely silent on a lot of ethical issues. There is a lot of talk about purity, and there's so much talk about purity that we can almost think to ourselves that being pure is morally good and being impure is morally bad. But you might ask yourself, okay, well, where does that sense of purity come from? And again, if you're coming from a more Western tradition, what we tend to associate impurity, especially with kind of sexual things, oftentimes, don't we? In Shinto, not so much. When they're thinking about impurity, it's mostly, or I think the most polluting impure force is that of death. Death is considered quite polluting to the extent that, lo and behold, well, we'll give an example here in just a little bit, for sure. So all of this is a bit of an introduction to the way side of the equation, the Michi side of the equation. Let us turn our attention, if we could, to the kami side of the equation in order to kind of penetrate the phenomenon a little bit more deeply, if you don't mind. Good, good, good. Whenever I consider the definition of a kami, I'm always returned to a very famous Japanese scholar from the 18th century, a man by the name of Moto Ori Norinaga. And Moto Ori Norinaga was a nativist. I think in today's times he would be considered rather controversial, but rather universally people understand that he knew ancient texts backwards and forwards. He knows this subject better probably than anybody. Very famously, Moto Ori Norinaga says, after a lifetime of study, I'm still not really sure of what the meaning of the word kami is. What? The ultimate expert on the kami related text, I'm really not sure what kami means. And what he's getting at is not that the concept of kami is like ineffable or super mysterious. What he's suggesting is actually it just applies to so many things that it's very hard to create a sort of limiting definition. So in his expose, he talks about, of course, the kami from mythology, the both heavenly and earthly. He talks about the deities enshrined in Japanese shrines as kami, but he also speaks more generally about things that possess unique, eminent, or extraordinary qualities, things that evoke a sense of caution within us. And I tell students, I think when we're considering whether or not something or someone is a kami, we can kind of use what I call the awe test. Does that make sense? If you see something and it strikes you dramatically, and you think to yourself, that's awesome, that would be a very strong candidate for being a kami. Does that make sense? If you see a beautiful sunset, it's really touched me, that could be a kami. If you turn on the television and you see one of those kind of amazing autonomous robots and You can push it over and it pops right back up and it seems like it's alive. And you're like, that's awesome. Okay, that would have the potential to be a kami. So in Japan, it is said, there's an expression, Yao Yorozu no Kami. There are 8 million kami. And 8 million is really just a suggestion that there are countless kami. So therein lies the difficulty of defining things, if you will. Good. So we have 8 million kami to consider. Why don't we, just for our purposes today, sort of book in the discussion and look at sort of the highest, most famous leader-like kami, and also at sort of everyday kami that Japanese people will consider in their sort of everyday existence. Does that sound like a plan? Good, good. I'm going to change my background for this purpose. All right, good. We'll take us to Yoshino there. So Japan has a series of mythological deities, and I think you might be a little bit surprised if you ask your Japanese friends about Japanese mythology. They may turn a little bit red in the face, and they might not be able to tell you many of the mythological stories. There's quite a few reasons for that, but Japanese mythology is primarily composed of 2 texts, the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki. And it's important to recognize that these texts are compilations of oral tales that were written down. Therefore, sometimes they're not perfectly consistent. They're not really even kind of logical because maybe there were many different versions that were told many different ways. Grandma tells a story this way, Auntie tells a story this way, and so forth. And when we're thinking about Japanese mythology, this is really important. If you're like me, when you first encounter Japan, you probably imagine it as being this incredibly ancient culture. But the Nihon Shoki was compiled in 720 CE and the Kojiki in 712 CE. So if you compare it to, say, Greek mythology, yeah, it's more than 1,000 years later. If we compare it to ancient China as well, Japan's kind of the new kid on the block when it comes to mythological terms in East Asia. So when it comes to mythology, what could be more important than the actual story of Genesis itself? And I apologize, I had a bunch of images for these things I'm talking about, but unfortunately, my background slides didn't transfer over. There's a heavenly plane called Takamagahara, and there are heavenly kami inhabiting this plane. There are a series of paired deities that come into existence sequentially, one after another. The paired deities are male and female, husband and wife, and Chinese people, traditionally Chinese people hated this notion. They are also brother and sister. The last of these paired deities are Izanagi, who's male, and Izanami, who's female. The other heavenly kami command Izanagi and Izanami to stand on a floating heavenly cloud bridge and to take a jewel-encrusted spear and to dip it from the bridge into something like a kind of a primordial ooze, if you will, kind of this basic substance. Mythologists will tell you to kind of imagine it like egg white, if you will. So they take the spear and they dip it into this egg white and they raise the tip of the spear up and it starts to coagulate on the end. And this drips off the end of the heavenly spear, dun dun, and it creates the first Japanese island. You can see we have a really Japanocentric notion of Genesis. The Japanese islands are the first islands made. Our new friends Izanagi and Izanami are the ultimate power couple. They set about creating all of the Japanese islands and all of the things in uh, on the islands that we need to survive, all the things of the world, if you will. Everything is going so incredibly well until poor Izanami gives birth to the fire kami, and she's burned horribly from the inside out, and she dies. Yes, important characteristic of Japanese kami. They are not immortal. They can pass away. In this case, poor Izanami has to go to an underworld. It's called the land of Yomi. And you can kind of imagine it as being like an underground tomb, if you will, dark and dank. You might say, wait a minute, didn't he just say Shinto doesn't talk about the afterlife? Well, to tell you the truth, I've never met a single Japanese person who believes that when you die, you go to this place. So even though it exists in mythology, it's not a common notion. In fact, Buddhism usually kind of handles most death-related things. But poor Izanami has to go to this underworld, and it's not hell. That's really important. She's not being punished. She's pure and good. It's just a place that beings seem to have to go to when they pass away. An intricate story takes place where Izanagi goes to the land of the dead and he tries to convince Izanami to come back with him. Long story short, it doesn't go very well. And they get into a terrible argument. And in the end, really, they kind of get divorced, if you will, and they sort of curse each other. It sounds like a terrible situation. When Izanagi leaves the land of the dead, he says to himself, I have been to the most unclean place. And he wants to purify himself. As we said, death is the most polluting force. So he goes to a river and he washes himself in a river to purify himself. Modern Japanese, by the way, if I don't know if you've ever been to a Japanese funeral, they will use salt over their shoulder to purify themselves. In fact, if you go to a funeral home in Japan, they have little salt packets. They look like sugar packets to give you to go home to purify yourself before you enter into the home. So Izanagi purifies himself, but something very good happens. When he washes his left eye, the great sun goddess Amaterasu comes into existence. When he washes his right eye, Tsukiyomi, the moon kami, comes into his existence. When he washes his nose, Susanoo, the deity who rules over the oceans, comes into existence. These are known as the three royal kami. And this is sort of like the completion of Izanagi and Izanami's work. Okay, these children are going to take over, and Amaterasu, the sun goddess, is a number one top deity in heaven. So Izanagi can retire and pass things on to the next generation. I think when we think about religion, we sort of hope that there was a time before politics sort of polluted what is true religion. But we can see in relationship to the kami, in relationship to Japanese mythology, it's really not possible. Ancient clan leaders were said to be descended from the kami themselves, and therefore they are a kami. Does that make sense? One clan will come to dominate over Japan. That is the Yamato clan. And the tutelary deity for the Yamato clan was and is Amaterasu. So the emperor of Japan is traditionally recognized to be the blood descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and therefore a deity themselves. Does that make sense? So if you're ever in Tokyo, the most famous Shinto shrine in Tokyo is Meiji Shrine. That's a a shrine dedicated to Emperor Meiji. The only exception is with Showa Tenno or Hirohito, who, under pressure from the American occupation in MacArthur, seems to renounce his divinity, and therefore there's no Hirohito related shrine. Good. All right, that's a super quick overview to sort of the most important mythological kami. Let's kind of bring things down here to earth, shall we? We can understand that Japan is a deeply animistic culture. Animism is the belief that things of the world, things like mountain, trees, waterfalls, animals, that they have a certain life force or an energy, a spirit or a soul. Maybe you've had like a favorite car or a favorite musical instrument and you give it a name, right? And you imagine certain characteristics of that thing as being like part of its character. That's sort of what we're talking about. Imagining, in some cases, that even inanimate things are alive. And so when we're talking about those countless kami, a huge number of them are animistic representations of things in the world. So let me give you an example. If you build a new building in Japan, say you're going to start new construction, you've got the ground cleared, you're ready to go. About 9 times out of 10, they will call in the Shinto priest, and the Shinto priest will say to the kami living in the ground, I beg your pardon. We're going to disturb you. We're so sorry for the intrusion. Please don't curse us. Okay, please don't attack us as a result of our intrusion. If you think about around the world, sacred foods, like for Christians, the bread and wine. If you think about Central Americans, indigenous Central Americans, you think of corn. If you think of Polynesians, you think of taro. I'm sure you know already, in Japan, the sacred food is, of course, rice, and of course, kind of the sacred beverage that, like for instance, that's drunk at wedding ceremonies, very ritualistically, is Japanese sake, or often called Nihonshu. So Japanese people will say that in 1 grain of rice, there are 7 kami. Can you imagine? 1 grain of rice, 7 kami. So this is probably like the ideal example of how everyday things become sacred. So as a word of caution, please, next time you're in Japan, or if you're in Japan now, please understand this. All Japanese people feel this notion with respect to rice. And so please don't waste any rice or food for that matter. I'm very careful to get sort of the last grains out of the bottom of the bowl. If you can't eat a full measure of rice, do the polite thing and ask for a half measure, because wasting rice is sort of an affront, really, almost sacrilegious, we might say, for these reasons. There it is, folks. My goodness, all we've done today is simply unpack a single term, and that is Shinto, the way of the kami. I'm genuinely biased, but my experience is working with students, if you sort of cultivate an awareness and understanding of Shinto, really you'll begin to see aspects of the tradition everywhere you turn, in Japanese culture and in Japanese society, in Japanese life. So thank you so much for listening to me there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schultz, for your wonderful presentation. I would like to start off with the Q&A session, if that is okay. So you mentioned like the Shinto shrine in particular, and in terms of like kami, there's so many types of kami. So I'm wondering, is it possible for people to be a kami? Because I do know from, in different shrines, people can be enshrined. So I'm also wondering, what is the process of a person after their death being enshrined into a Japanese shrine?
That's a great question. What a great question to start with. Absolutely. The question is, can people become commies? Absolutely. Humans can become kami, and kami can become humans. So I don't know what your life goals are. There's still time. Uh, there are numerous ways for an individual to become a kami. One way would be just to be an amazing person. There was a while for a while in Shinsaibashi here in Osaka. There was the Bob Dylan Shinto shrine. Just being a great artist would be kind of understood to be sort of kami-like. So in Japanese, like Korean pop stars are sometimes called nantoka sama, to kind of show kind of like diva, if you will. Diva also means sort of implies divine. The most common One of the most common ways people have become kami is through military service, either becoming fantastically powerful and important warlords, like in the case of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Oda Nobunaga, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Uh, they gained a kami status, or, and maybe you've had this experience as well, there is a very famous, sometimes often thought to be kind of infamous for non-Japanese shrine next to the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. That is for individuals who died in service of the emperor, and they are also enshrined as kami as well. So that would that's another. I don't recommend any particular path to kamihood. I'm just laying it out there for your thoughts. Um, Another way would be to be a sort of evil spirit. So, say for instance, you vanquish your enemy on the battlefield. Okay, you just you wipe them out perfectly. Uh, hey, I won. It's over, isn't it? Yeah, not so much. Oftentimes, in traditional Japanese culture, it's thought you can vanquish your enemy, but in death, their spirit comes back to attack you. And it's oftentimes quite necessary to quell the spirit of your defeated enemy. And the easiest way, one of the best ways to do that, is to make them into a kami. And so at Yasukuni Shrine, which I was just referring to, which is dedicated to Japanese war dead, there's also a sub shrine, guess what? Dedicated to Allied forces that were killed by Japanese troops. Showing respect to them in order to for many reasons, but especially to calm their spirits down. So yes, absolutely. There are Shinto shrines in Hawaii where George Washington and King Kamehameha are enshrined as kami. Absolutely, and you can also be demoted from kami status back to human status too, in certain instances. So great question. Absolutely, you certainly can.
Well, thank you so much. My other question was, so you touched on it in your presentation about death, and how death is, the opposite is an impurity in terms of like Japanese shrines. So when we talk about people becoming kami, I'm just curious, why is it that, for example, a person in mourning is not allowed to visit a shrine? What is the belief behind that?
Okay, yes, yes, yes. And again, Shinto is not so doctrinal that we can point to, specific points to say this is why death is considered to have this sort of pollution. But for instance, if we look at mythological sources, we can just see the examples of ancient Japanese in the tales, and their associations with death as being so uh, potential, well, so polluting and so impure. So there, for instance, there's a famous example in the Kojiki where the heavenly kami kill uh, a kami on Earth, and they're having his sort of funeral, and there's a specially constructed building, and his parents come to the funeral, and his parents see one of his best friends, and kind of in their state of mourning, they actually kind of hallucinate and think that the best friend is actually their dead son. And they're so happy, and they try to embrace him. And his reaction is complete rage, that he would be associated with a dead body, even though it's his best buddy. And he takes out a sword and he destroys the whole building. And he creates this kind of ruckus scene, that such is the case. But the other part of your question that you're suggesting is, isn't this kind of a special case? That is to say, when you're making the dead a kami, yeah, in general, Shinto would kind of like to avoid dealing with death, but this is kind of a special case. In Amani, this is kind of a case where we see kind of the influence of Buddhism on Shinto related thinking, in particular as well. So kind of a bit more of the exception to the rule. In Japan, there's a really famous expression: born Shinto, die Buddhist. And maybe in contemporary Japan, we could say, born Shinto, marry Christian, die Buddhist. But Shinto priests are very happy in general to let Buddhist priests take care of that business of death. And hey, give us the newborn babies. We'll happily bless them with their first visit to the shrine. So this expression comes up quite a bit.
Thank you so much. So some questions from the chat. So Carly Shimizu said, the word pagan comes from contrasting indigenous beliefs with Christianity. So is it really appropriate to call Shinto pagan? It seems to me that calling Shinto just animist is overly simplistic.
Oh, let's see. I wouldn't I wouldn't use the term pagan with respect to Shinto. That's correct, and I don't know of any scholars of religion that do. Now, sometimes we use terms in a social scientific sense in the study of religion without a particular value judgment. Is that clear? So, for instance, social scientists use the word cult without talking about kind of pejorative, scary, brainwashing people. We talk about like the cult of Mary, for instance, in Christianity and so forth. So I think I understand your concerns, and in absolutely our use of terms changes over time. But to the best of my knowledge, using animism with respect to global religious traditions in general, or Shinto in particular, has been relatively non-controversial. It seems to sort of fit the situation. Now, that's again coming from a social scientific perspective. Maybe a practitioner, maybe a Shinto priest might take issue with the term, but that convention has sort of stood. So but in the spirit of your question, we should always be sort of reassessing our terminology and how we're describing things. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. William Yale asked, can you talk about the contemporary relationship between the Shinto, the Association of Shinto Shrines, and right-wing politics in Japan?
Okay. All right. All right. All right. Good. Not perfectly. I have friends that are experts, and they could speak about this in real detail. And again, we have to exercise some genuine caution when we're talking about religious traditions, especially in public. As I was speaking, the sort of connection between the Emperor of Japan, in really sort of the institution of the emperor as a political institution, it kind of comes in a sense to its peak under the Empire of Japan. And there's a period in which Shinto enjoys state sponsorship. That is to say, it receives money directly from the Japanese government, from taxpayers. And Shinto becomes like semi-obligatory during the rise of the Empire of Japan. Now, we probably don't think of Japan as like a culture of holy warriors, but in fact, there's like several significant examples of religious warriors throughout Japanese history. And I think if you're familiar with the Second World War, you understand the notion of devotion of a soldier to the emperor and sort of a willingness to die for the emperor and for the imperial institution. And that's really kind of uh, much of what Yasukuni is about. Now, I often tell my students that the history of Japan and the history of the United States have become deeply intertwined in recent years. And with the American occupation of Japan from 1945, the US mandates that Japan can no longer sponsor Shinto as sort of a state religion, if you will. So Shinto is no longer sort of state sponsored. Now, that doesn't mean that, sure, of course, that certain right-wing groups still attach themselves to the tradition, and especially to the institution of Yasukuni Shrine itself. Now, the Association of Shinto Shrines, or the Jinja Honcho, is the main organization, kind of umbrella organization for uh, Shinto shrines around the country. And if you look at their materials, there's a very and we get almost close to doctrine. There's the implicit assertion that Amaterasu, the great sun goddess, is the number one kami, and that therefore Ise Shrine is the number one shrine. That's where Amaterasu's kind of her main residence. And so some people might say that tendency can still be seen in institutions like the Jinja Honcho, the tendency towards, say, support for the imperial institution, which some people might understand as being a kind of inherently conservative stance, if you will. But another important thing to understand is religion in Japan is not very top down. That is to say, it's not like the Pope in the Vatican giving very strict mandates. Hey, you guys have got to do this. You've got to teach this. Individual Shinto shrines and individual Shinto priests have considerable latitude with respect to what they do in their particular shrines. And so there doesn't appear to be, if you look at Jinja Honcho materials, like if you go to a Shinto shrine, you'll see posters put out by the Jinja Honcho, and those are all very nationalistic, directly associating the tradition with a Japaneseness. Absolutely. And think about that for a second. Most people, if they're involved in a religion, sort of imagine that their religion is perfectly universal. But here's kind of an assertion that this is a Japanese thing for Japanese people. So certainly you can read nationalistic sentiments into certain representations and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, compared to the way things were at the height of the Empire of Japan, we don't really see, we certainly don't see government support for Shinto. However, some Shinto institutions are magnets for people who are right of center, no doubt about it. If you go to Yasukuni Shrine, you will see those people, those black vans that are blasting sort of right-wing messages and so forth, to be sure. So people on the right naturally gravitate towards Shinto in some instances, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Carly Shimizu asked, why did Shinto not develop a doctrine or become doctrinal? Or doctrinal? You hinted there was a reason.
Oh, yes. Well, again, that's a great question. And I'm speaking in broad strokes, and there were some exceptions, I should say, particularly in the Meiji period. There were some Shinto thinkers that were developing rather specific doctrines and so forth. But because for most of Japanese history, Shinto coexisted with Buddhism, Buddhism is pretty sophisticated in terms of texts, in terms of doctrines, and so forth. So I don't want to speak in too broad of strokes, but that could be one reason why, for instance, Shinto was less doctrinal. But really, even in mythology, you simply do not see an appeal towards a lot of super deep thinking and so forth. So I can't state across unequivocally throughout Japanese history why such was the case, but almost certainly it was the coexistence of Shinto alongside Buddhism that uh, probably, again, created a division of labor where Buddhism was the more heady aspect, if you would. I would cover that for sure.
Thank you. MKM Jin asks, one understands that Shinto and Buddhism both are followed, in many cases by the same Japanese person, one faith or the other, at different times, depending on the purpose or circumstances. If this impression is correct, can you please elaborate on how a Japanese person or family blends Shinto and Buddhism into their life?
Okay, great, great. Absolutely. Absolutely. So um, I've had several Japanese students do really excellent video projects for me, and they'll take a Japanese person and throughout their lifetime, and they'll sort of tell a narrative starting from birth, going all the way to death, and they sort of highlight various religious aspects of their life. So, uh, for instance, as I mentioned before, and you'll see this at Shinto shrines, and it's so adorable, bringing a baby to the shrine to meet the kami for the first time. It's such an adorable, it's really cute. It's almost kind of like a baptism, if you will, as sort of a first religious ritual. Um, Also at 7, 5, and 3, many kids will engage in ritual practices at Shinto shrines. So you'll see these really cute kids in their kimono getting their pictures taken. Uh, in those times, it there are yearly repetitions. Almost all Japanese people will go to either a Shinto shrine or to a Buddhist temple at New Year's, for instance. Uh, Think about this. I mentioned Meiji Shrine once before as a shrine dedicated to an emperor. More Japanese people go to Meiji Shrine for New Year's than Muslims go on the Hajj. Let that sink in. It's kind of mind-blowing if you think about it, really. So seasonal worship, certain times a year, going to Shinto shrines. Traditionally, for instance, there were always festivals around the harvest, and so in Japan, matsuri are almost always connected to kami. There's very rarely a matsuri that doesn't have a sort of kami-based theme. So if you're a fan of kami, that's all really sort of like a large-scale festival ritual practice, if you will, for Shinto. When it comes to good luck and bad luck years, you might want to check. Men and women have good luck and bad luck years that pop up throughout their lives. Some folks will visit Shinto shrines, some folks will visit Buddhist temples, to be sure. And then finally, of course, usually the funeral would be uh, taken by Buddhism. Uh, and also various memorial services would take place in increments after a person passes away. So it does. It's exactly the case. Japanese people can engage in both traditions without any thought that they're violating one or another, if you will. So Japanese are really quite open-minded when it comes to myriad deities. Indeed, when Christianity was first introduced in Japan by Francis Xavier, Japanese people were very enthusiastic. Oh, a new kami! We were so bored with the old kami, a brand new kami, and there was real enthusiasm there. So that's a tendency exists now and has existed for a long time, to be sure. So yeah, it's a great point. Japanese people can participate in both Shinto and Buddhist rituals without sort of any sense of violation of the two traditions. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Scott Bailey asked, he said, excellent professor, excellent talk, Professor Shultz. Can you speak a little bit about the role of nature or the natural environment in Shinto?
Yes. Professor Bailey is much wiser than I am. As you know, Amani, to be sure, a scholar and a gentleman, if there ever was one. It's a great question. And to tell you the truth, many students are attracted to my courses with the idea that Shinto is a nature religion. And that's true, absolutely, to a large extent, but we need to qualify that a little bit. That is to say, Professor Bailey, you know well, it seems like natural forces are constantly conspiring to kill Japanese people. Earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, typhoons, volcanic eruptions, landslides. Nature is dangerous in this country. And so, yes, Shinto has traditionally been a nature religion, but not in a sense of like a European romantic ideal, like nature is perfect, uh, just left as it is. No, no, no. Nature is scary and deadly. And we need to employ uh, Shinto practices in order to keep nature calm. Don't kill us, please, nature. Was is really kind of the subject of sort of Shinto in nature. Does that make sense? So it's a lot different motivation out of a sense of fear more than just pure reverence. I love nature, and in fact, Professor Bailey, we can understand that when the heavenly kami descend to Earth, there's kind of the notion that earthly kami, including natural kami, are unruly. So this kind of again gets back to politics a little bit. It's the heavenly kami, including Amaterasu, that bring a sort of orderliness, a sense of civilization, not only to human existence, but also to the natural world, which left to its own will try to do us in, and is wild and unruly. So yes, absolutely. Shinto's a nature religion, but that's a really important qualification. It's much more Shinto's a nature religion. Don't kill us, nature, please. So, as a point of qualification, excellent question, Professor Bailey. Thank you.
So on the topic of natural kami, Sebastian Denal asked, what about that fox deity Inari that you see many times in shrines? Is that kami?
Great question. Thank you. Thank you for asking that. That's a great question. So, uh, is the fox, which you can see everywhere. So, first, let me mention, okay, we've been talking about kind of a division of labor between Shinto and Buddhism, but there's also a division of labor between kami. That is to say, some kami we might pray to for learning, like Tenjin Sama. Some kami we might pray to for love, like Okuni Nushi, and so forth. So if you go to a Shinto shrine, you'll see many sub shrines related to many various kami. And invariably, no matter what the type of Shinto shrine, one of those sub shrines will have fox statues. These statues are really helpful because uh, there's not a lot of statues in Shinto. There's not a lot of visual iconography in terms of the deities themselves. The fox statues are related to Inari Kami. There are 8 million kami, but we can say almost unequivocally, Inari is the most popular of all kami. About 1/3 of Shinto shrines are connected to Inari. And to answer your question, Inari is not the fox. The fox is actually the messenger of the deity. The actual form of the Inari kami is a little bit mysterious and somewhat variable. So the fox is the kami's shinshi, sort of a helper deity. And sometimes you'll see a little scroll in the fox's mouth carrying the message for the Inari kami. So why is the Inari kami so popular? Boom, it's going all the way back to the last point we spoke about, and that is Inari is associated with rice and with agriculture and those staples that we need to live. And for much of Japanese history, this culture was based on a cereal currency. That is to say, rice was not just something to eat, but it was also a unit of money. And so, therefore, Inari Kami is associated with wealth, worldly prosperity, success in business, and so forth. And so, uh, it's quite understandable that everybody from farmers to business people, if you see a shrine at a business, like say for instance in the parking lot or on the roof, probably that's an Inari shrine, usually speaking. So yes, that's a very important kami that every person connected with Japan should be aware of. When you see the fox, you want to think that's Inari kami, the deity of agriculture and money and so forth, to be sure. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you for asking that question. It's really, really important. Arguably the most important kami.
Thank you so much. So the next question comes from, or the next two questions comes from Erling Agoy. First, how do Shinto priests and lay people relate to texts like Kojiki, simply as ancient legends or any role in worship? And also, how do you think Shinto can be related to traditions elsewhere, such as Korean shamanism or Buddhist-influenced folk religion in Vietnam?
Okay, okay, good, good, good. Um, when it comes to Shinto priests, now Shinto priests have a really strict educational system, and there aren't many, by the way. Really, only a fraction of Shinto shrines. I think it's like 1 in 7 Shinto shrines that you visit would have an attendant priest. Oftentimes, they're taken care of by the really cute grandmas and grandpas in the neighborhood, and so forth. So there aren't, compared to Buddhist priests, there's really only a fraction of the number of Buddhist priests amongst Shinto priests. And so, but certainly another reason why there aren't so many Shinto priests is it's actually really tough. There's a very strict curriculum, a very strict testing system, and so forth. And absolutely, you can imagine the mythological texts such as the Kojiki are a really important part of that education. I think most importantly, that mythology gives us the kami that are worshipped, including, say, for instance, Amaterasu or Susanoo or Tsukiyomi, to be sure. The second part of the question, and this is really kind of key because I think a lot of people will refer to Shinto as the indigenous religious tradition of Japan. But I've seen really convincing arguments to suggest that, guess what? Japanese Shinto in its origins looked a lot like Korean shamanical traditions. And in fact, a lot of elite Japanese immigrants who came in with strong skills, verily the imperial family itself of Korean origin, it's very likely. We don't want to we want to kind of recognize that it's very likely that much of maybe the form of early Shinto, in fact, came from a Korean shamanical tradition. That may be difficult to prove unequivocally, but I've seen good academic arguments to suggest that that's the case, to be sure. So nativists are going to like that sort of notion that maybe the tradition has kind of origins in Korea. But as to your question, I think that seems really quite logical, and good scholarship has kind of laid out that argument as well, to be sure.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Schultz, we have quite a few more questions left and we're running out of time, but would you mind if we do two more questions?
2 more sounds great. Yes, yes, of course.
Thank you so much. So the second to last question comes from Hyun Tran Tue. I'm so sorry if I said your name, mispronounced your name, but in your opinion, what impact did the coming of Buddhism in the 6th century AD to Japan have on the role, position, and content of Shinto?
Okay, to be sure. So, but again, to put things in context, if we can imagine, so if the Shinto mythological texts are compiled like in 712 and 720, again, we can see that they're really the two traditions in some ways are kind of arising simultaneously, to be sure. So there's a story in the Nihon Shoki about 2 clans, and one clan with the introduction of Buddhism is saying, hey, we can't worship those foreign deities. Of course, our local kami are going to get very angry if we do that. And as the story goes, the Soga and the Mononobe clan fight a battle, and each one prays to the Buddhas, one prays to the kami, and guess what? The Buddha side wins. And this is kind of a telling in Japanese mythology for sort of how the Buddhism is let in. Now, the actual mechanics on the ground are a little bit different, but I think, and then at a more basic level, for instance, Buddhism has a whole pantheon of gods, especially esoteric Buddhism. There are hundreds and hundreds of deities. So the idea of incorporating Shinto kami alongside a tradition that already has hundreds and hundreds of deities is not particularly problematic at all, for sure. And then in some cases, they will say, for instance, oh, no, no. Amaterasu, the great sun goddess, is actually an avatar of Dainichi Buddha, the great sun Buddha. So there'll be kind of a notion that certain deities are avatars of one another as well. So that's a rather simple quick answer to a great question, but you could write a whole dissertation on it for sure.
Thank you so much. And the last question, it comes from William Greensfield. Can Shinto go through a reformation or a synthesis itself, once again, with Buddhism, as so to have a central figure?
Oh, let's see. Now, I'm not sure if he's asking that question insofar as like looking to the future, if Shinto could have a reformation, or if in the past Shinto has had a sort of reformation. If he's speaking in terms of history, absolutely. With the separation of Buddhas and kami in the Meiji period, that's a major reformation. And essentially speaking, Shinto is kind of placed on the top of the worldview hierarchy for Japanese people. To be sure, that I think we can call that a significant reformation. And there was kind of blowback on Buddhism at the time. Some temples were burned down, some Buddhist images were destroyed, and so forth. So that was absolutely the most significant reformation we could think about. And so, visually speaking, when you go to a famous Japanese temple, please notice you'll see the temple, and then you'll see a fence, and then you'll see a shrine right next to it. If you go to a famous shrine, you're going to see the shrine, you'll see a fence, and then you'll see a temple right next to it. Those were one and the same institution that were forcibly separated right at a particular period in time, to be sure. So looking towards the future, that would be more kind of conjecture, to be sure. What does the future hold for Shinto? It's shown to have tremendous flexibility. So, yeah, I can't speculate, but to be sure, I think we can say the most significant reformation in Shinto was the separation of the kami from the Buddhas. To be sure, that's a great question too. Wow, very articulate bunch here. Some really great questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shultz, for answering a lot of our questions. I'm so sorry if we were not able to get to all of the questions, but thank you so much once again, Dr. Shultz, for your presentation today and taking time out of your day to be with us. And thank you, audience members, for all of your wonderful questions. We had so many questions, so many questions. And once again, thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation, New York. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending tonight. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dr. Shultz, for your wonderful presentation. It was great to listen to your presentation, and also we really appreciate that you engaged with our audience. We hope everyone to see you next Tuesday and at the other YCAPS events. Thank you once again, everyone. Take care.